Unaware that his pregnant ex-wife is now married to a billionaire, Richard Blackwell sat in his Bentley 50 yards away, laughing with his mistress Vanessa about the muddy water they had just splashed all over Emma. Suddenly, a convoy of black Range Rovers with government plates pulled up to the street corner where his ex-wife stood dripping and shaking. Richard's laughter died in his throat as he watched security personnel form a protective barrier around the woman he had just called barren and worthless. He watched a man in an expensive suit step out and wrap a coat around Emma's trembling shoulders. He watched that same man's face transform from concern to murderous rage as Emma told him everything. "Wait," Richard whispered, his hands starting to shake on the steering wheel. Is that Alexander Sterling?" Vanessa's face went white. "Oh my God, Richard, that's the Alexander Sterling, the billionaire's son. What did you just do?" But Richard couldn't answer because Alexander Sterling was walking directly toward their Bentley, his eyes locked on Richard like a predator who had just found his prey. In that moment, Richard Blackwell realized with absolute horror that the poor, desperate woman he had just humiliated in front of cameras wasn't struggling at all. She was married to the man who controlled every contract, keeping his £47 million empire alive. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just shock Richard and his mistress. It destroyed them in ways they never saw coming. By the time Alexander's father made his announcement on live television 3 weeks later, Richard would lose his company, his fortune, his mistress, and every shred of dignity he ever had. Richard was still laughing, still pointing at Emma covered in mud, when he heard the sound of engines, multiple engines approaching fast. His smile faltered. Vanessa was reapplying her lipstick in the visor mirror, still giggling. "Did you see her face?" "God, Richard, you're terrible." She looked like a drowned rat. Richard wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the 3 black Range Rovers pulling up in perfect formation, their windows tinted so dark you couldn't see inside, their license plates bearing government seals that made his stomach drop. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "we should go." But it was already too late. The doors of the first Range Rover opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. Not regular security, but the kind that protects heads of state. They moved with military precision, scanning the street and forming a perimeter around Emma, as if she were royalty. Then the back door of the second Range Rover opened. Richard watched, his mouth going dry, as a man stepped out, tall, in his late 30s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Richard's car payment. He had dark hair, a strong jaw, and a presence that made everyone around him look smaller. The man's eyes immediately found Emma, and something shifted in his face. Concern, then horror, then something cold and dangerous that made Richard's hands start sweating on the steering wheel. "Oh my God," Vanessa whispered, her lipstick forgotten. "Richard, is that Alexander Sterling?" "It is," Richard said, his voice strangled. He watched as Alexander Sterling, son of Lawrence Sterling and heir to a £12 billion empire, rushed to Emma and wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders. He watched as Emma looked up at Alexander with tears streaming down her mud-covered face. He watched as she pointed directly at Richard's Bentley. "Richard," Vanessa's voice rose in panic. "That's Alexander Sterling. The Alexander Sterling. Why is he?" "She married him," Richard said, the words feeling like broken glass in his mouth. Emma married Alexander Sterling. The pieces clicked together in his brain, each one worse than the last. The simple gold band on Emma's finger he had dismissed as cheap, the way she'd been glowing despite being covered in mud, the protective way her hands had gone to her pregnant stomach. Not shame, protection. That baby was the Sterling heir. Richard had just splashed muddy water all over Alexander Sterling's pregnant wife, the future mother of the Sterling dynasty. And he had done it while laughing, while calling her barren, while his mistress cackled in the passenger seat, while a teenager filmed the whole thing. "Drive," Vanessa said sharply, her voice filled with fear. "Richard, drive right now." But Richard couldn't move. He was watching Alexander Sterling's face as Emma told him what happened, watching his jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. Then Alexander looked directly at the Bentley and started walking toward them. "Oh God," Vanessa whispered. "Oh God, Richard, he's coming over here." Richard tried to start the car, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the key in the ignition. Alexander reached the Bentley and bent down to Richard's window, his face perfectly calm, which somehow made it 1,000 times more terrifying. "Richard Blackwell," Alexander said quietly, his voice like ice. "I'm Alexander Sterling. That woman you just covered in mud is Emma Sterling, my wife, the mother of my child, and you're going to pay for every second of what you just did to her." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Vanessa tried to lean across him. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. We didn't know." Richard said she was nobody. "Get out of my sight," Alexander said, not even looking at her, his eyes locked on Richard. "You have 10 seconds to drive away before I have you arrested for assault." Richard finally found his voice. "Alexander, listen. It was just a joke between exes. I didn't know she'd remarried." "A joke?" Alexander's eyes were murderous. "You mocked her dead baby. You called her barren. You humiliated my pregnant wife on a public street while someone filmed it. Does that sound like a joke to you?" Richard's phone started ringing. He ignored it, but Alexander smiled. A cold, predatory smile. "You should answer that." The phone kept ringing. Richard's hands shook as he pulled it out. The screen showed his board chairman's name. "Hello." Richard's voice cracked. "Richard," his chairman screamed. "Sterling Global Holdings just pulled out. Everything. £340 million in contracts gone. They're citing ethics violations and conduct unbecoming." "What did you do?" Richard's face drained of all color. He looked at Alexander, who was still standing there, watching him with those cold, calculating eyes. "That's just the beginning," Alexander said softly. "By tomorrow morning, you won't have a company. By next week, you won't have a reputation. And by the time my father is done with you, you'll wish you'd shown my wife the respect she deserved." Alexander straightened up, turned around, and walked back to Emma, wrapping his arms around her and helping her into the Range Rover as if she were made of glass. The entire convoy drove away, leaving Richard sitting in his Bentley with his chairman screaming in his ear and Vanessa staring at him with dawning horror. "Richard," Vanessa said slowly, "what have we done?" The video went viral in 17 minutes. By the time Richard got home, it had 10 million views. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, investors, board members, all demanding answers. Vanessa sat on his couch scrolling through social media, her face growing paler with every swipe. "Richard, they're calling you a monster. My Instagram is getting flooded with death threats." Richard tried to call his PR team, his lawyers, anyone who could make this go away, but every call ended in panic and blame. By morning, 3 major banks had called emergency meetings. With Sterling contracts frozen, Richard's credit lines were at risk. They demanded £60 million within 30 days. "We can liquidate assets," Richard said desperately. "Mr. Blackwell," his banker interrupted coldly. "You assaulted a member of the Sterling family on camera. No bank in Britain will touch you." The stock market opened, and Blackwell Estates shares began to plummet. Richard watched his personal fortune evaporate, £22 million gone in 6 hours. His board called an emergency meeting and voted to remove him as CEO effective immediately. That night, Richard sat in his Mayfair flat watching the news coverage on every channel. He looked like a villain, because he was. Vanessa walked in with 2 suitcases. "Where are you going?" Richard's voice was hollow. "I'm leaving," she said, not looking at him. "Matthew Thornton called, the hedge fund manager. He wants to take me to dinner." "You're leaving me for someone else?" "I'm leaving you because you're about to lose everything, Richard, and I'm not stupid enough to stay." She grabbed her bags and walked out. The door closed, and Richard sat alone, realizing he had destroyed his marriage to Emma for Vanessa, and Vanessa had never cared about him at all. 3 weeks later, Richard was living in a 2-bedroom flat in South London. The Mayfair penthouse had been seized by the banks, the Bentley repossessed. He now worked as a property consultant, making £65,000 a year, less than Emma had made as a teacher. He saw Vanessa's engagement to Matthew Thornton announced in the Times and the Sterling Family Charity Gala broadcast live on BBC One. Richard told himself he wouldn't watch, but at 8 p.m., he turned on the television. The ballroom was magnificent, filled with Britain's most powerful people. And there was Emma, standing beside Alexander in an emerald gown that perfectly showed her 6-month pregnancy. She was glowing, radiant, confident, and loved. At 8:15, Lawrence Sterling took the microphone. "Good evening. Before we continue, I have joyful news to share," he said, and the room went silent. Many of you know my son Alexander married the love of his life this year. Emma Sterling has brought light and purpose to our family. Tonight, I'm honored to announce that Emma is carrying my first grandchild, the heir to the Sterling family legacy. The room erupted in applause. Lawrence's voice grew stronger. Emma has taught us that true worth isn't about wealth. It's about character. It's about treating every human being with dignity. His eyes seemed to look directly through the camera, which is why I want to be clear. Anyone who disrespects my family, who would harm my daughter or endanger her child, will face consequences. We protect our own. Everyone in the room knew exactly who he meant. Richard turned off the TV with shaking hands. 3 months later, the headline screamed, "Emma Sterling welcomes healthy baby boy." Photos showed Emma in a hospital bed, exhausted and glowing, holding James Lawrence Sterling, with Alexander beside her and Lawrence beaming in the corner. Richard saw the coverage on the tube heading home from work. A woman across from him was reading to her daughter from a picture book. The little girl pointed at a newspaper photo. "Mommy, is that the nice lady from TV?" It was Emma at a school opening, surrounded by children. "Yes, darling. That's Mrs. Sterling. She helps children learn to read. She's pretty. She is, and very kind." Richard looked away, staring at his reflection in the dark tunnel window. He saw a man who had destroyed the only woman who ever truly loved him. A man who had splashed mud on a queen and called her worthless. A man who had lost everything because he never understood what mattered. The Bible says in Galatians 6 verse 7, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Richard sowed cruelty and reaped destruction. Emma sowed humility and reaped a kingdom. He didn't lose Emma to Alexander Sterling. He lost Emma to himself. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories that prove character, not wealth, determines destiny. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share this with someone who needs to remember that how we treat people matters more than what we own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well enough that karma handles the rest.